Welcome everyone to Close Reading Poetry. My name is Adam Walker, and today we are going to be reading some of Taylor Swift's lyrics. Taylor Swift, her songs have gotten some literary attention of late, and in fact I've had a couple requests on this channel and emails from people asking, could I do something on Taylor Swift? And I thought, well, why not? A year or two ago I was teaching sections of Shakespeare and popular culture here at Harvard, and the undergraduates there really showed me how really connected Taylor Swift is to the lyric traditions, both in English and going all the way back to the classical lyricists, such as the female poet Sappho. And we had great discussions, pairing her songs with some of the major themes in the plays of Shakespeare. So I thought I'd do two things in this lecture. The first is to see how Taylor Swift's lyrics respond to the kind of close reading that I do on this channel. And then the second is to locate Taylor Swift within this larger context of literary lyricists. So let's look at her poetry, its themes, its images, its ideas, its conceits, within the context of other lyric poets from the past. Because I think for a lot of the people who come to this channel, they're interested in learning poetry, they're interested in where to start and where to begin and how to read poetry. And I think it's best to always start with what's most familiar, to learn your tastes and to go from there onward to new literary discoveries. So I hope that this video helps you do that. Now when we talk about lyrics, songs lyrics, we're talking about the purely verbal component of the art form. Popular contemporary music involves many different kinds of art form. There's performance on stage, there's musical accompaniment, there's lighting, there is the music video, which is its own form. Poetry might be described as the verbal art of human life and experience in verse form. And we know that poetry regulates itself differently from prose, such as the mode of writing in a novel or a newspaper. Aristotle said there were three different kinds of poems. There was the epic poem, which is a long narrative poem that follows the life and events of a hero or a group of heroes, either in war or a journey. Then there's the dramatic poem, which is meant to be performed on stage and taken in by the spectacle, by actors repeating the lines, and usually these lines were verse poetry. Sophocles, Euripides, all the way up to Shakespeare, they all wrote in verse. But the third kind of poem is a lyric poem, and this tends to be what we think of when we think of a poem. It's short, it's brief, it's personal, it deals with emotion, with passion, it has a confessional voice, this what's called a lyrical I, this persona of the poem, and the I within a poem is oftentimes separate from the identity of the poet. Not always. Some confessional poetry is meant to be autobiographical, but when you refer to the I of a lyric poem, it usually stands in as simply the persona in the poem. Well, one of the most powerful motivations for provoking a poet into lyrical utterance is that of the broken heart. And Taylor Swift is, I think, rightly and sometimes unfairly called a breakup songwriter. A lot of her poems have to deal with this idea of a breakup and the experience. But it's something that goes all the way back. It has a great literary precedence. There's a pedigree for this. And one of her earliest songs, it's not a breakup song, but it is a broken heart song, is Teardrops on My Guitar, which is very interesting because in it, the lyre, or the guitar, the musical instrument, is a part of the song. It gets mentioned. You'll find that this happens all the way from classical poetry up into the English Renaissance. Now there came a point when the lyric poem was separated from the lyre, and it became purely a literary artifact, or object, rather. And this was mainly in the Renaissance period. You have Sir Thomas Wyatt, who was perhaps the last great lyricist to write lyric poems for the accompaniment of a lute or a lyre. But then you get Shakespeare's sonnets, Michael Drayton's sonnets, Edmund Spenser's sonnets. And these are meant to be spoken, read aloud, so that the human voice itself becomes the lyre. The poem spoken is the instrument. But go back to classical literature, the earliest forms of lyric poetry across many cultures, and you'll find that it's uniquely bound up with the instrument. It's true for the Hebrew psalmists, It's true for Sappho and the Greek poets. It's true for some of the West African lyricists and poets. It's true for Chinese lyricists. So there's this deep connection with the lyre, with the musical instrument itself. So let's look at just the first two stanzas of Teardrops on My Guitar with the chorus. And immediately, when you begin to read, you know that we're in the world of the lyric. Drew looks at me. I fake a smile so he won't see. Here's the lyrical I. You see, there's already a division between the public facade, the public self, and the private self, and we are immediately in this confessional mode. She is revealing something to the listeners, or the readers, that she's not revealing to Drew. Public self divided by private self, in this confessional mode. I think part of her success, Taylor Swift's success with her fan base, is sustaining this illusion that she's having this intimate confession with them and that we are privy to. I fake a smile so he won't see. That I want, and I'm needing. Interesting verb change. Want and needing. Everything that we should be. So already we're beginning to understand what's happening here. This is a poem about unrequited love. Many poems deal with this theme of unrequited love. And this is an experience that many poems in the past have dealt with and will continue to take up. It's an experience that we all have felt, or perhaps are feeling, or certainly will feel. It's part of what makes this such a good poem that resonates with people. I'll bet she's beautiful, that girl he talks about. She's got everything that I have to live without. Notice that balance there. She and everything, I without. So you've got this completive everything. She, I am without. And you have these contrasts there. And she'll play with this construction a bit, this scheme. And let's move to the next stanza. As she's playing the confidant to Drew, we're playing the confidant to her. Drew talks to me. I laugh because it's just so funny. Actually, the way she pronounces this word funny in the song is metrically awkward. We would pronounce funny like this, funny. The stressed syllable here on this syllable, fun, and the unstressed syllable on funny. But she, in the song's performance, stresses both syllables, making it metrically awkward, enacting the awkwardness of having to fake a laugh. So funny. It seems forced, just like we suspect this laugh is not genuine. Notice Drew is talking, but she never speaks to Drew in this poem. Listen to the whole poem. There's not a word spoken by her to Drew. He says he's so in love. He's finally got it right. I wonder if he knows he's all I think about at night. Of course, this will remain a wonder, and probably not a likely wonder. But notice this C is repeated. The second time C has happened. Drew is looking at her, but he's not really seeing the real private self that is revealed to us. He looks at, he talks to, but he doesn't see her. That's something that we are only privy to. Now let's go to the chorus, because this is where the lyre is introduced. He's the reason for the teardrops on my guitar. Here's the lyre. And notice she doesn't say she's just sad and she's playing. There's this, it's the signification of the bodily teardrop falling upon the object of the instrument. That's just a very unique and I think interesting image. And it's something that if you go back to old poetry, you also have instances of something from the body comes in contact with the instrument. You think of the Homeric hymn to Hermes, where Hermes is sitting outside his cave and he sees a tortoise walking by and he says to the tortoise, I will make you sing forever. I'm paraphrasing. And he takes the tortoise and there's this violent ripping apart of the tortoise. and he guts it and he makes it into a lyre, and this lyre in the poem will have this redemptive power for him. Just like Orpheus, who takes his lyre into Hades, to the king and queen of Hades, to sing to them and ask them for his wife back who has died. And so he sings so beautifully that they agree that Eurydice, his wife, can leave the underworld and return back to earth. Of course, something else happens in that story. Read it for yourself. It's in Ovid's Metamorphoses. If you look at the West African epic, Gesseri's Lute, the young prince Gesseri goes to a smith and says, "Make me a lute." And the smith says, "I will, but it will not sing for you." And so he makes the lute, and Gesseri can't get it to play. And he says, "What must I do to get it to play?" And the smith says, again paraphrasing, "You must take it into battle, and it must come into contact. It must be drenched with the blood of your sons, your family, and your armies before it will sing." And it's almost as if this sacrifice activates the poem, activates the lyre. And we see something suggested here, I think, that's very interesting, this idea of sacrifice, of redemption, as though the song itself could save something, could preserve something. I see this here. The only thing that keeps me wishing on a wishing star. He's the song. And you listen to it, you maybe not, that doesn't come to your attention, but think about it. He's the song. It's as though the song itself has become one with the person. I'm going to return to this idea of the song being able to contain and preserve what cannot be physically had. But let's return back to this line, wishing on a wishing star. The repetition of that word wishing. And you might think, well, she made a mistake, because often we're taught when we're writing essays not to repeat the same word twice. You don't want to be repetitive. So why does she do that? In fact, why doesn't she say shooting star? Why have the verb form wishing and immediately following it the adjective form wishing? I think to avoid, for two reasons. The repetition of a word, as Wordsworth and many of the rhetoricians of the 18th century have said, often signals towards passion. And if you want to represent deep feeling in poetry, you will repeat in different ways. There are different ways to repeat, some of them very ingenious, some of them schematic, some of them tropological. So that's one reason, because this is a moment of deep passion. The other reason is, I think, to avoid the word shooting. Shooting has, the image of it. It's there, it's gone, it's ephemeral, and almost your experience of it is purely mnemonic, because it's there, it's gone, and then what you have left is just simply the memory of that instance. She doesn't want an image of that kind, because she's in this fragile state where she wants to preserve Drew. She wants Drew herself, but she's in this state where he does not want her. And I think to say wishing star instead of shooting star is perhaps playing into that anxiety. Now, okay, he's the song in the car I keep singing. I don't know why I do. It's beyond consciousness, her understanding. It's a compulsion, perhaps. Now, at this point in the lecture, you might be thinking, I get this all the time. In fact, I got it 2 days ago when I was teaching high school students. One of them said, I don't mean to be rude, they're so polite, but I don't think, you can't expect me to believe that the poet actually is aware of everything that's going on so intricately in the poem. You English professors are always reading into poems and making them sound smarter than they really are. And there are three things I'll say to that. Language itself is much more crafty and complex than the speakers of that language oftentimes. So there's this inner reason. We actually don't really need to know whether Taylor Swift organized this poem so intricately. I think she did, by the way. But the poem itself as an object, and the success of that poem depends upon how the words are interacting. It's also true that a poem can mean something more than the author intended. I.A. Richards and T.S. Eliot were writing letters back in the 1930s, and Richards asked Eliot about Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday, by the way, if you've never read it, it's very complex. It's difficult to understand. The plain meaning is not there, really. And so many people have different interpretations. And Richards was asking Eliot about this, and this is what Eliot said: that if the reader knows too much about the crude material in the author's mind, his own reaction may tend to become, at best, merely a kind of feeble image of the author's feelings. Whereas a good poem should have a potentiality of evoking feelings and associations in the reader of which the author is wholly ignorant. I am rather inclined to believe for myself that my best poems are possibly those which evoke the greatest number and variety of interpretations, surprising to myself. So in one sense, it doesn't really matter what Swift meant. We're not trying to figure out what Swift was trying to do. We're trying to figure out what the poem does, actively does. And the other thing is this: poetry is an art form that is infinitely complex. So complex, so much more complex than people, I think, are prepared to believe oftentimes. A young, aspiring poet once wrote to Wordsworth, and Wordsworth said, he warned him, he said that, here's the quote, that poetry is infinitely more of an art than men are prepared to believe, and absolute success in it depends upon innumerable minutiae. Don't underestimate the level of unconscious or subconscious awareness that's going on in the composition of a poem. Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, took years to write. Maybe it takes 15 minutes to read. He absolutely was aware of the intricacies there, what Wordsworth calls the innumerable minutiae that contributes either to the failure or the success of a poem. And the third thing I'll say is this: don't underestimate Taylor Swift as a lyricist. Don't underestimate her own knowledge of the lyrical tradition. There have been some things. My wife just sent me an email a couple days ago of an article about Taylor Swift and Emily Dickinson. And the article was highlighting certain familial connections, but also lyric connections as well. I think she's highly aware as a poet. I think she knows what she's doing, and I think she's familiar with the English tradition and American tradition of lyric poetry. Now, before we move on, he's the song. I want to come back to this idea about the song being able to preserve something important that the speaker wants to preserve. I think this is an important impulse in Taylor Swift's poetry across the long arc of her career, is this anxiety of losing, this need to preserve not just her own memories, but the memories of the lovers with whom she parts, whether she breaks up with them or whether they break up with her. She wants to be remembered, and she also wants to remember. And the lyric poem is sometimes the conduit for that. This has great literary precedence. You go back to Horace's odes, and it's the Latin poet Horace, he's also playing with the same idea. But I think to go to a poem that's very familiar with us, Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. And before we get to 18, let me show you 15, where I think this idea begins to be developed in Shakespeare's sonnet sequence. So in this poem, the speaker is talking about how his beloved will decay. Their beauty will decay. This is true for all of nature. And that time and decay are debating on how they're going to destroy you. But, he says, and here's the couplet that just snaps shut at the end of his poems, of his sonnets. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. You might think of the agricultural engrafting, where you take a branch and splice it onto another branch and it grows together. That's true, but it also goes back to graphene, the Greek word to write. And so he's writing him new. He's preserving him into the sonnet, the youth. And then we get to Sonnet 18, famous poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But here's what's called the volta, the turn in the sonnet. After the first 8 lines, you have the sestet, the 6 lines, where there's a shift. But Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. Lines of poetry. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this poem, and this gives life to thee. So the poem itself is able to give life, to preserve what cannot be. And I think memory is a very important thing in Taylor Swift's poems. I mean, look at another 2008 song, Fearless. This is just 4 lines from the poem. So baby, drive slow till we run out of road in this one-horse town. I want to stay right here in this passenger seat. This demonstrative pronoun, very present. You put your eyes on me. She wants to be seen. And we saw that in Teardrops on My Guitar. I noticed this figure of putting your eyes on me. In this moment now, capture it, remember it. Her poems want us to remember, want the beloved to remember. She wants to remember. She wants her poems to enshrine the memories that she thinks worth keeping. And there's this redemptive power sometimes that memory has for Taylor Swift's poetry. We go to Mine in 2010, making our way into some of her later work. We see that the memory of a beautiful moment actually saves the relationship. So this song tells the story of adolescent love maturing into adult love. There are times in a couple's relationship that will make or break, will strengthen or completely shatter the relationship. And memory is the key function, the key object that keeps the relationship together. Here's the chorus, and this is the key memory. Do you remember, key question, when we were sitting there by the water? You put your arm around me for the first time. You made a rebel of a careless man's careful daughter. You are the best thing that's ever been mine. Notice, I was just, in my Paradise Lost lectures, I talk a little bit about scheme and how Milton will use chiasmus and a certain type of chiasmus called antimetaboly. This exchange. This is kind of clever. It's antimetaboly. Careless man's careful daughter. Antimetaboly is A, B, negative A, negative B. And we see that here. Man, daughter. Careless, careful. It's clever. Country music does this a lot, as does some pop music. But this is the memory, sitting by the water. Purely, we might think commonplace and mundane. But as the relationship matures, they're in the world together. They have bills to pay, nothing figured out. And what strengthens them is this memory. Do you remember we were sitting there by the water? Do you remember the city lights? You saw me start to believe for the first time. There's almost like a conversion. I was blind, but now I see. You saw. Again, presence of seeing. She wants to be seen, and being seen is very important. She wants us to see the speaker. The speaker wants to be seen as well by the beloved. You are the best thing that's ever been mine. Now, when the intrusion of a memory of that fight, and we think, maybe something is lost. Fighting at 2:30 a.m., that must be pretty bad. As everything was slipping right out of our hands, ran out crying, and you followed me. She thought he was going to leave her, and what does he say? He repeats the memory. So this memory is redemptive. It saves, it salvages, it's able to preserve. And in a way, the poem enshrines that memory and amplifies its power of preservation. It's redemptive in a way. We see this in Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. Beautiful poem, by the way. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art or that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Remember, each sonnet has this turning point at the volta, the 9th line. Yet in these thoughts myself, O most despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like a lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. The memory of the beloved redeems this moment of self-pity, of misery, of despising his own state. So let's continue with this idea of memory, because I think this is important for her career. We go back to 2006. Taylor Swift's Tim McGraw. Again, it's not so much that she wants to sometimes keep the memory, that's true, but she also wants to be remembered a certain way. She writes her own elegies, and she says this in another poem. But when you think Tim McGraw, I hope you think my favorite song, the one we danced to all night long, the moon like a spotlight on the lake. She loves the image, by the way, of light on the water. And who doesn't? The moon like a spotlight on the lake. When you think happiness, I hope you think that little black dress. She also likes to be remembered in dresses, as we'll see. Think of my head on your chest in my old faded blue jeans. When you think Tim McGraw, I hope you think of me. Two lovers are parting. She's taking consolation in the fact that she will return to him unbidden every time he hears this song. And so the song itself becomes the conduit by which the memory is preserved. It's almost, in religion, you'd call it a sacrament. Do this in memory of me. And it's the ritual repetition that preserves the memory and makes it a part of one's life. Now, trace this impulse a little further up in her career to the Wildest Dreams from 2014. Let me just close read this poem, and I'll bring in memory on the side. He said, let's get out of this town, drive out of the city, away from the crowds. I know this seems like a great temptation that Taylor Swift often has, or at least it's representative in her poems. I don't know much about Taylor Swift. I'm not saying that I do. But her poems often have this wistful longing for retirement. And there are great poems of retirement. Perhaps one of the best is Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, where he has that line, far from the maddening crowds, it's away from the city. I thought, now she's revealing her thoughts, so again, the lyric mode of revelation and confession. I thought, heaven can't help me now. Idea of heaven, she tosses it so idiomatically that you wouldn't read anything into the religious power of that word. But it comes up again. Heaven can't help me now. It's as though she is foreseeing her downfall, because nothing lasts forever. But this is gonna take me down. She knows where this is going to lead. Nothing lasts forever. This just statement. Nothing lasts forever. It's a beautiful statement. It's also something that is an anxiety underlying many of her lyric poems, but it's also an anxiety that's present in many elegies, in many poems. When you think of Robert Frost's Nothing Gold Can Stay, nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so in hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. So when you're thinking of something passing away, often you get this religious imagery of heaven, of hell, but mostly of the lost state, of perfection, of beauty, of everything that should be. Eden, if you don't know, in the Jewish scriptures, the Christian scriptures, Eden is the state of paradise where Adam and Eve lived and held communion with God, and they trespassed, and then they were expelled. Eden can't last. I love this poem, by the way. These couplets are trying to hold, like the hardest hue like the gold. They're cupping hands, these couplets, these rhyming couplets. Gold, hold, flower, hour. Feminine rhymes here. Leaf, grief, day, stay. And the poem ends with that word stay, echoing in our minds. And then the poem falls silent. Stay. So nothing lasts forever. Let's go back to this. This is going to take me down. She knows she's going to fall. And there's this religious idea of the fall, of the lapse from Eden. And notice we get some more religious imagery here. He's so tall and handsome as hell. Okay, another idiomatic simile. Well, this is a simile, but another idiomatic use of religious words. But you see, it's playing into the power of the poem through association. He's so bad, but he does it so well. I can see the end as it begins. My one condition is... Okay, so she's not being taken in by some rake. This is not Lydia going off and being wedded to Mr. Wickham. She knows how this is going to end. And she counts it worth it based on this condition that we'll see. She's naming the terms of remembrance. It's not unlike Edna St. Vincent Millay's sonnet about the cigarette, only until this last cigarette is ended. And here's Millay. She's an excellent poet, by the way. And she's remembering a departed lover. This is a little different from Wildest Dreams, but she says, I will remember you as long as this cigarette lasts. Only until this cigarette is ended, a little moment at the end of all, while on the floor the quiet ashes fall, and in the firelight to a lance extended, bizarrely with the jazzing music blended, the broken shadow dances on the wall. I will permit my memory to recall the vision of you, by all my dreams attended. Here's the turn. And then adieu. Farewell. The dream is done. Remember this dream here. Your memory itself as a dream, very important for poetry. Yours is a face of which I can forget the color and the features, every one. The words not ever, and the smiles not yet. But in your day this moment is the sun upon a hill, after the sun has set. Wow. Again, idea of dreams as being the conduit here. No longer songs, no longer objects, at least sometimes in Taylor Swift's poetry. The dreams are objects, are the memory, the conduit of the memory, the mnemonic pathway back to her. Sometimes is an object. Here it's a dream. Say you'll remember me, standing in a nice dress, staring at the sunset, baby, red lips and rosy cheeks. Say you'll see me again, even if it's just in your wildest dreams. And we've seen this in other poems too. If we turn to the Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's stanzas, we'll see dreams acting the same way. Oh, come to me in dreams, my love. I will not ask a dearer bliss. Come with the starry beams, my love, and press mine eyelids with thy kiss. 'Twas thus, as ancient fables tell, love visited a Grecian maid, till she disturbed the sacred spell, and woke to find her hopes betrayed. But gentle sleep shall veil my sight, and Psyche's lamp shall darkling be, when, in the visions of the night, thou dost renew thy vows to me. Here's another thing about Taylor Swift's poem. My one condition, my last request, she says later on in the poem, is to remember. There's this vow that she wants him to say. So this is part of how this is tapping in. Some of the images in that poem and the impulses within this one do overlap. Then come to me in dreams, my love. I will not ask a dearer bliss. Come with the starry beams, my love, and press mine eyelids with a kiss. Now let's turn to Retirement. This is her more recent song from 2020, The Lakes. And we saw earlier how her love songs didn't just offer an elegy. She wrote them for the beloved in saying, I hope this is how you remember me. The conditions and all were met. I hope you'll agree to this. And how she is aware. Is it romantic how all my elegies eulogize me? Question mark. Now the key word here is romantic. She's not just talking about erotic romance or the romance of love between two people. She's interested in the romantic movement, the artistic movement, the art and poetry movement of the early 19th century and also the late 18th century. And the answer is yes, it is romantic in that sense. I'm not cut out for all these cynical clones, these hunters with cell phones. Take me to the lakes where all the poets went to die. She's withdrawing from this fight with cynical clones, people without real identities who are just critics. These hunters with cell phones. This idea of the hunter, of the injured poet, withdrawing into nature to heal from the wounds that the city has inflicted, and what the clones have inflicted, is something we see quite often during this period of romantic art and literature, late 18th century especially. If we go to William Cooper, William Cooper's The Task is an epic, part mock heroic, part autobiographical. And he writes, and you might know William Cooper from the hymns that he wrote. They still sing them in many churches in America, at least today. But this was his long poem, written in blank verse. I was a stricken deer that left the herd long since. With many an arrow deep infixed, my panting side was charged, when I withdrew to seek a tranquil death in distant shades. Oh, beautiful line. A tranquil death in distant shades. He's actually withdrawing to die as a poet after being injured from the city. But he says, and here's how it's partly a religious text, there was I found by one who had himself been hurt by the archers. Remember the hunters? In his side he bore, and in his hands and feet, cruel scars. And of course, Cooper, speaking of Christ here, that he found spiritual nourishment, an actual conversion experience in the retreat. Is Taylor Swift aware of Cooper? Is she drawing on him? I don't think she has to be aware of him. I'm not trying to make that argument. She could very well be. It would not surprise me one bit. But this impulse to withdraw after being wounded is not something that's just in one poem. It's in many poems, and it's something that I think many people can relate to. So let's go back. Take me to the lakes where the poets went to die. I don't belong. And my beloved, she addresses, neither do you. Those Windermere peaks look like a perfect place to cry. I'm setting off, but not without my muse. Now, Windermere, by the way, a mere in the Lake District. Wordsworth lived there, lived near it. He actually lived in Grasmere, which was not far from Windermere. And he lived between Grasmere and Windermere during the later part of his life, near Rydal Mount and just above Rydal Water. So this is a part of the landscape of the Romantic movement, and she's, of course, making connections to this. What should be burrowed under my skin? In heart-stopping waves of hurt, I've come too far to watch some name-dropping sleaze tell me what my words worth. What are my words worth? And of course, this is a bit on the nose. It's a little bit of humor. She likes to take herself seriously and then kind of diffuse that or dilute the seriousness with this funny rhyme, waves of hurt, words worth. It reminds me of a rhyme when Samuel Taylor Coleridge sent his poem, The Nightingale, to Wordsworth in the late 18th century. He sent his poem, and as a note, he wrote another poem, and he says, and like an honest bard, dear Wordsworth, I know you'll tell me what you think my bird's worth. Meaning the Nightingale poem, what you think my bird's worth. Hilarious. Their friendship is just wonderful, Wordsworth and Coleridge's. But anyway, that's an example of a rhyme with Wordsworth. And of course, she doesn't combine the words here. Anyway, again, the chorus, and then this, she brings in romantic imagery. I want auroras and sad prose. Auroras, by the way, figured greatly in late 18th century travel accounts and romantic poetry. You go down to Wordsworth's The Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. This is from Lyrical Ballads. Before I see another day, Oh, let my body die away. Again, this desire to die, to blend into nature. In sleep, I heard the northern gleams. Remember the dreams? The northern gleams. And you can hear the auroras kind of rustle. The stars, they were among my dreams, in rustling conflict through the skies. I saw the flashes drive. And yet they are upon my eyes, and yet I am alive. Northern gleams are the auroras. It ends, before I see another day. Oh, let my body die away. This desire to die. And then not only to die, but just to kind of melt into this state, of sleep, of fusion with nature. And that you can find right here in this line. I want to watch wisteria grow right over my bare feet. Wisteria, a woody, creeping vine that also grows up over things. Beautiful and fragrant lavender-colored flowers that are in the shape of grape clusters. But bare feet, this is significant because it's an unmediated contact of the body and the earth. Is where the body meets earth. It's your contact with nature. And she wants them bare, unmediated. In a way, just to be blended. The way Marvell, or Andrew Marvell, I should say, has that line, a green thought in a green shade. He just wants to melt into the green shade. Because I haven't moved in years. I haven't moved. It's almost like Wordsworth's, a slumber did my spirit seal. No motion has she now. She neither feels nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees. It's a moment of stasis. So all of that's going on. I think it's fair to say that the 2020 album is very, very much embedded within the tradition of Romanticism and with some of the themes there. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it's helpful to see how contemporary poetry is rooted in interesting ways to a long tradition of lyric poetry, engaging with old motifs and reinventing images, and even the elegiac mode itself is reinvented in interesting ways in many of Swift's poems. Thanks for watching, and until next time.